In the 1980s, California was gripped by terror. A brutal serial killer, later dubbed the Night Stalker, stalked the streets, leaving a trail of violence, fear, and confusion in his wake. For over a year, no one knew who the killer was or when he would strike next. It wasn't until 1985 that the police finally caught up with the man responsible for the gruesome murders, Richard Ramirez. His case, one of the most infamous in criminal history, would leave a lasting mark on the state of California and beyond. So how did Richard Ramirez become the monster known as the Night Stalker? Let's explore his rise, reign of terror, and eventual capture. The early years. A troubled beginning. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, into a violent and dysfunctional family. His father, Julian Ramirez, was abusive, subjecting Richard and his siblings to physical and emotional torment. This harsh environment would shape Richard's future. His mother, Mercedes, tried to shield him from the violence, but the trauma from his father's behavior had a deep impact on young Richard. At 12, he was introduced to his cousin Mike, a Vietnam War veteran, who showed him photos of gruesome killings he had committed during the war. These images disturbed Richard, sparking his fascination with death and violence. As a teenager, Richard started experimenting with drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD, and engaged in petty crimes like theft. His erratic behavior became more evident, signaling the path he would soon take. The Night Stalker strikes. In the early 1980s, Richard Ramirez moved to California. It was here, in the sprawling cities of Los Angeles and San Francisco, that he would begin his killing spree. His first known crime occurred in 1984, when he broke into a home in the city of Burbank. He attacked a woman in her home, but she managed to escape, and he fled before he could do more harm. It wasn't until the following year that the full extent of his horrifying acts would come to light. In 1985, Ramirez embarked on a series of brutal murders and attacks that terrorized Southern California. His victims were chosen at random, and his methods of attack were unpredictable and horrifying. He would break into homes at night, often armed with a handgun or knife, and commit violent acts of robbery, rape, and murder. The brutality of his crimes shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. Ramirez's first confirmed murder took place on May 29, 1985, when he killed a woman named Maria Hernandez in her home in Rosemead, California. He shot her in the face, but she miraculously survived. However, her roommate, Dale Okazaki, was not so lucky. He shot and killed her in cold blood. The violence only escalated from there. Over the next few months, Richard Ramirez carried out a string of attacks that left Los Angeles in a state of fear. His victims were both men and women, and he often chose elderly or vulnerable people. He was known to enter homes through unlocked windows or doors, and would often attack his victims in their beds. His method was to overpower them, binding them with ropes or handcuffs, before robbing them and sometimes sexually assaulting them. The police were baffled. Ramirez's attacks were so erratic that they couldn't find any clear pattern. There were no witnesses, no DNA evidence, and no motive. He seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The only clue the authorities had was his signature. He would often leave behind strange, unsettling symbols at the crime scenes. One of the most infamous marks he left was a pentagram, which became his calling card. The terror builds. As Ramirez's reign of terror continued, the city of Los Angeles became paralyzed with fear. People began locking their doors and windows at night, and rumors spread about a satanic killer. The media amplified these fears, describing Ramirez as a demonic figure who worshipped Satan. One chilling aspect of his crimes was that there appeared to be no clear motive for his murders. He wasn't interested in robbing for wealth. He wanted to inflict pain and terror. He would often tie up his victims, rob them, and sexually assault them before killing them. This sadistic behavior made him stand out from other criminals, and police struggled to identify him. By mid-1985, the pressure on law enforcement was mounting. Every attack was more brutal than the last, and the public was demanding answers. Ramirez's crimes were becoming more brazen, and the police were under intense pressure to solve the case. The breakthrough, a clue from the streets. The turning point in the investigation came on August 30th, 1985. After another attack in Whittier, California, Ramirez was spotted by residents who recognized his face from the media. Realizing he had been seen, he tried to flee, but a group of residents chased him down and caught him. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but it was the moment that finally ended his reign of terror. Ramirez was handed over to the police, who quickly linked him to the string of murders. His arrest was a relief to a city that had lived in fear for over a year. The trial. Ramirez's trial began in 1988, and it quickly became a media sensation. His appearance in court only added to his notoriety. He often smiled and made unsettling gestures, including raising his hand to form a devil's horns gesture, further feeding into the public's perception of him as a satanic figure. During the trial, prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence, including fingerprint and DNA evidence that linked Ramirez to the murders. His defense team tried to argue that he was mentally ill, but the jury wasn't swayed. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death. Life on death row. Although sentenced to death, Ramirez's time on death row was long and filled with controversy. He spent 23 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, but during that time, his case became a symbol of the flaws in the American criminal justice system. Many people were appalled that he had been allowed to live for so long, given the brutal nature of his crimes. Ramirez became something of a media sensation. He was the subject of books, documentaries, and even fan mail. Some women even claimed to be in love with him, despite his horrific crimes. This strange phenomenon baffled many, but it only added to the dark allure of the Night Stalker. During his time in prison, Ramirez's behavior remained erratic. He continued to embrace his persona as a satanic figure, and he was known to engage in bizarre behavior. He also showed no remorse for his actions and rarely expressed any regret for the lives he had taken. In 2013, Ramirez's death sentence was overturned, but he continued to sit on death row until his death from complications of B-cell lymphoma on June 7, 2013, at the age of 53. The legacy of the Night Stalker. The story of Richard Ramirez is one that still haunts California to this day. His killing spree was one of the most brutal and terrifying in the history of the state, and his arrest was a moment of relief for many who had lived in fear of the Night Stalker for over a year. But the case of Richard Ramirez also raises troubling questions about the criminal justice system, the media, and the lasting impact of his crimes. Ramirez's trial, his behavior, and his continued celebrity status, even after his conviction, demonstrate the strange, twisted fascination that some people have with serial killers. His crimes left an indelible mark on the city of Los Angeles, and his legacy remains a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unsuspecting places. To this day, the name Night Stalker sends shivers down the spine of anyone familiar with the story. Richard Ramirez, the man who once haunted the streets of California, will never be forgotten, and the terror he unleashed will remain a part of criminal history forever.